Hello, welcome to Kelly's Cult Classics, my booktube channel. Today we are going to be talking about The Picture of Dorian Gray. I've been wanting to read this book for a while. I don't know why, it's just one of those classics that I always was like, maybe I should read that one day. I went into this book with some expectations, but not many. Like I knew the general premise that there was this guy named Dorian who had a portrait of himself and he stayed the same and the portrait got older, or so that's like what I thought the premise was. For some reason I thought it was like a horror book on the level of like Frankenstein and Dracula, you know, like 1800s horror. It really wasn't that, to my surprise. It's not that the book was bad. I actually quite enjoyed it. The writing was very engaging. It was written in like the 1890s, and you know, sometimes with books from the 19th century, they can be dryly written, but this definitely wasn't the case. It almost read as if it was something written like just a couple decades ago instead of over like a century ago. So that was my first expectation, was that I was going to be in the same vein of like Frankenstein, and it definitely wasn't. It was more metaphorical than it was horror. And because the thing is, this painter paints a portrait of Dorian and it's a beautiful portrait, and Dorian is like, I wish that I could never grow old like this portrait, and instead the portrait grows old and reflects the harshness of life or whatever. And that's kind of what happens, is that Dorian goes through his life and the things that happen to him and the things he does to others, and his age reflects in the portrait but doesn't reflect in him. He stays the same as how he looked in that portrait. Which, okay, that's another thing. I went in, for some reason I thought the book was gonna take place over generations, like several human lifetimes, because he kind of becomes like an immortal, you know? But it actually only took place over 20-ish years, which that was really surprising. Like, I really liked the book, but I kind of do wish that it went over a longer period of time, because then I think we could have got the full grasp of the fact that like he wasn't aging but his portrait was. And maybe like the portrait didn't make him immortal, we don't know, because it only lasts 20 years and 20 years is not immortal. So who knows? Those two expectations, that it was a horror novel and that it took place over generations, those were the only expectations I had going into the book, and both of them were wrong. But despite the fact they were both wrong, I still really enjoyed this book more than I thought I would. And the reason I liked it so much, I think, was twofold. One, the metaphor of the portrait I do think was beautiful. It's not just that the portrait got older and Dorian Gray stayed the same. It's just, so Dorian Gray kind of became a corrupted character. So he starts out, you know, kind of, I got the vibe of like angelic and perfect and innocent and naive, and then he progresses, he gets corrupted by this other character and he becomes a horrible person, leads to the inadvertent death of several people, is just terrible, honestly. Oh, he also just straight up murders someone, the painter of the portrait. So over time he becomes like, he not only gets older and the portrait gets older, but he stays young. As he becomes a horrible person, he still looks like that naive person that he was when the portrait was painted. Whereas in fact he became more cruel, and it really reflected in his portrait. Like his portrait became crueler when he murdered the painter. There's like blood on, like literal blood on his hands appears in the portrait. And so like the portrait becomes more of like not only an outward reflection of Dorian, but an inward reflection, and it kind of reflects his true nature as like a kind of terrible human being. I mean, honestly, like I thought Dorian was, I don't know why I had this picture, given that I never read the book before, but I thought Dorian was gonna be like this suave guy who like maybe was just really vain, who was a suffering soul that we could relate to. But like honestly, I didn't relate to Dorian. He was terrible to this like young girl who was like, I think maybe 18ish, 16, who was an actress, and he fell in love with her because of her acting. But then the moment she stopped acting well, he was horrible to her, tore her apart, and then she committed suicide. And I'm like, that's awful that he treated her that way. Then her brother like becomes obsessed with revenge, and that revenge eventually leads him to being accidentally shot in the woods. And that's also sad because this guy just wanted his sister to be happy, and Dorian destroyed that happiness. And then he straight up murdered the painter, and then he forced this guy to help him cover up the murder, and the guy was so torn because he like blackmailed this guy, and the guy was so torn up that he eventually committed suicide. And it's just like, Dorian, stop being terrible. So I really I like Dorian for the metaphor that the story created with Dorian and his portrait, but I didn't like him as like a character. I would never name a child Dorian, like, oh, I want you to aspire to be Dorian. No one should aspire to be Dorian, okay? Because you're gonna end up murdering your former best friend in like this weird room that you lock up, and then you're gonna force someone to like dissolve his body over a fire. It's gonna get weird, okay? So don't be like Dorian. The thing I liked best about this novel, however, was the reflection it has on Oscar Wilde's life. And I know that Oscar Wilde, like, in the preface of the book, he says that you can't read too much into an artist's work and, you know, take it literally. However, so I was reading the book, and not even like that many pages in, I started getting like vibes that some of the characters were gay, and then that made me wonder, like, was Oscar Wilde gay? So I like looking up the background of novels. I think it like enriches your reading experience if you know who the author was, where they're coming from, the setting in which the novel was written. And honestly, like, I'm glad I looked that up, because I found such a fascinating history that is tied to both Oscar Wilde and this book. So yes, Oscar Wilde was probably gay. Apparently he was a pretty flamboyant guy. Sounds kind of fun, like sounds like someone I would want to meet. Sadly though, he was gay in a time where it really wasn't okay for someone to be gay. I think it was like the father of one of his lovers accused him of being gay or something like that. And Oscar Wilde tried to sue that father for like slander, and his friends all were like, Oscar, maybe you shouldn't do that, because like you are. And at the time, I guess, in order to prove slander or libel or whatever, you had to prove that what you said was true. So then the court case began with this father's attorneys trying to prove that Oscar Wilde was indeed gay, and he was well known in certain circles at the time, so they were able to find like several witnesses. And also they used this book as evidence against Oscar Wilde, proving that he was gay, because there are several scenes in the book where two males definitely are, like, either one of them is clearly in love with the other, or there's like sexual tension there. When this book was published, it was really controversial. There was like some scandalous scenes, and there's this whole history of like editing out certain scenes and adding in others. But overall, they actually used this book against Oscar Wilde in the trial, and the trial led to Oscar eventually dropping the charges of slander against the lover's father. And then there was a trial, or like a case opened up against him for being gay, which is absolutely awful, because Oscar was just trying to live his best life, you know, write some good books, and people come at him like, you like guys, that's not okay in 1890s England. So he then goes on trial and is found guilty, and is sentenced, I think it was like 2 or 3 years in prison, and it was a really rough time, because like 1890s prison, not where you want to end up. Horrible. And he becomes like significantly weakened health-wise in prison, and when he gets out, I know that he wrote like a poem about the conditions of the jail he was in, and that becomes really famous, and he became kind of like an advocate for improving prison conditions. However, he only lived a few more years after he got out of prison, and then he died in France. Oh, he also had to like leave Britain. And so I just find it really interesting that this book kind of did reflect Oscar Wilde in the sense, like, for so many years he had to hide who he was from the very critical society of the time, and then when it finally emerged who he was, it basically destroyed him. It destroyed his health, it destroyed his reputation, very unfairly. We know that now. It gave me a lot, because I looked that up like not that far into the book, so for the rest of the book it gave me a lot to consider, and like it gave different meanings to different parts. And so I think like one of the great things about this book is the history tied to this book. If you're interested in learning about early LGBT culture, I would definitely recommend this book. And I felt so bad for Oscar Wilde, and I think it made me appreciate the book that much more, because I learned like just how much of a risk it was for him to write it, and how it led to him literally being imprisoned. And that's horrible. It shouldn't be like that. Don't imprison people for writing books. Like, don't. I have a mug. It's about all the banned books. I don't think The Picture of Dorian Gray is on here, but it was definitely a banned book. So I don't support banning books, because even if you disagree with things, you should still read it, or let others read it if they want, because, you know, don't be horrible. Don't ban books. Don't ban ideas. Let's all just talk like we do on this booktube channel. So one criticism I do have of the book is that a lot of the book it just takes place with conversations between people, so there's not like much action happening. It's just like 2 or 3 people talking, which isn't my favorite kind of book. I prefer things to be more like plot driven, action driven. It's not necessarily a problem with Oscar Wilde, it's more that was just one of the writing styles during that period. So just to warn you, a good chunk of the book is just basically all conversations, which can get a little dull at times. It's like, I get it, you guys are talking, can something actually happen? And so it's important to the plot though, like some of the conversations. And near the end, when he murders his former friend and the painter, things kind of pick up more, because, you know, he's gotta cover up a murder. And as you can imagine, things get a little more urgent, and some more things happen. So near the end, it does get better with all the conversations, like things actually occur. But in general, I really enjoyed this book. I do recommend it. Anyone who's interested in classics, I think this is a good one to read. Not too dull, pretty interesting history, you know, like definitely look up in Wikipedia the history of the novel and the history of Oscar Wilde. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed our discussion. Like my video, share my video, comment on my video, and we can have a discussion about The Picture of Dorian Gray. I hope you guys have a good rest of your weekend. Happy Mother's Day. Bye!